Thank you, Gloria. Thank you all again for humoring me and showing up, particularly on a rainy day like this. I know there's other things you can do, like wash your hair. And so I appreciate the fact that you're here. Just a reminder, if you're here because you have an opiate addiction, that's the meeting down the hallway, although you may want to go there after my talk today. We'll see how that goes. I hear that Governor Douglas was here about a week ago. I don't know how many of you got a chance to see him. He's now my colleague. We hang out quite a bit together at the college, Middlebury College, and I was warned beforehand that he planted the seeds of some questions here to try to trip me up, but I'm on to him. Of course, I asked him what he talked about, and he said about an hour, which is typical Jim Douglas humor if you know him. My topic today is actually my second book project, The Evolution of the White House Staff in the Post-World War II Era. Gloria said she was getting tired of me coming down here and making election forecasts that were wrong. So she said, why don't you talk about something that presumably you know something about? And so I said, okay, I'll talk about the White House staff, but to make it somewhat relevant, I'm going to talk about the White House staff in the context of Donald Trump's presidency. So I'm going to spend about half an hour putting you to sleep by talking about my research, the evolution of the White House staff, and then the second half of the talk, roughly about 20 minutes, I'll try to give you some preliminary assessments of Donald Trump's White House staff. Be forewarned, they're not very optimistic assessments at this point, but also you should know that these early assessments of White House staffs historically are often quite wrong in the sense that we're basically relying on the same sources you are, the New York Times, the Washington Post. And these aren't necessarily good sources, particularly with a lot of what they write about is based on anonymous sources. And it's not really until we get into the archives that we really figure out who the major staff players were, who was meeting with the president when, and so on. We just don't have any of that information about Donald Trump right now. So I'm going to talk about Trump a little more speculatively than I'd like to. So bear with me and feel free to push back against me during the question and answer. Of course, many of you are going to want to talk about Donald Trump more generally. Feel free in the Q&A. As always, I'm going to throw a lot of slides at you. I'm going to move very quickly. If you have questions about any particular slide, raise your hand, stop. I'm glad to take questions in the middle of the process. So let's get started. As Gloria mentioned, I did my graduate work and taught at Harvard University, and my graduate work was for this guy, a guy named Richard Neustadt. Neustadt was a very famous presidential scholar, somebody who had a huge influence, not just on me, but on the study of the presidency more generally. But he began first as a White House aide for Harry Truman before having to get a job after Truman left, and he moved into academia and then wrote perhaps the best-selling book ever on the presidency, Presidential Power and the Modern Presidents. My students are, fortunately or not, basically forced to memorize this book. Word for word, it sort of infuses everything I teach and my current research. And one of the most important things that Neustadt found out as being an advisor to the president is that the key to being an effective president is information. And the information that you get from your White House staff is not necessarily the information that you need to make effective decisions and be an effective president, because your White House staff, for reasons that I'm going to talk about, don't necessarily see things from the exact same perspective of the president. So every president is faced with this dilemma, which is, how can I utilize my staff in a way that provides me the information that I need from my perspective that will advance my political interest, as opposed to information that might prove self-serving to my White House staff, who, as ambitious, egotistical individuals who believe that they were hired to do certain things as well, are often trying to push their own agendas. So one of the myths I want to puncture right now is that White House staffs are always working on the same page with presidents. They often are not. And so as a member of Truman's staff, Neustadt saw this firsthand, and part of this effort in writing this book was it was a manual to presidents to advise them on how to utilize their staffs most effectively. That's not all it was about, but that was a good chunk. And so I'm going to try to apply Neustadt's lessons here and talk about Donald Trump. And here again, the key to exercising effective influence: a president is helped by what he gets into his mind. His first essential need is information, but not just any information, not just what you can get from the New York Times or the Washington Post. It is information that alerts you to the personal stakes when choices come before you. So exposure to details of operation and of policy provide the frame of reference for details of information. If I'm going to issue an executive order banning travel from immigrants from 7 predominantly Muslim nations, it's not simply enough for me to know the details of that executive order. I need to be told what's the likely reaction if somebody brings a lawsuit. How are my political allies and my political opponents going to discuss this? This is the type of information, Neustadt argues, that a president needs because it's crucial not only to achieving his goals, making sure that terrorists don't come in the guise of immigration, but also maintaining my political support down the road. So if I issue this executive order, what's the impact going to be on my ability to get things down the road? Am I going to be, for instance, hung up in court cases, tweeting wildly about how my own Justice Department is subverting me, right? For instance. All right. So when Neustadt was president, working for the president, I tend to think of him as president, but he wasn't. He was building on an infrastructure laid down by these 3 public administration theorists. The guys from left to right, and I'll quiz you on this later. That's Luther Gulick, Charles Merriam, and Louis Brownlow. When Franklin Roosevelt was president in the depths of the Great Depression, he created all sorts of administrative agencies to deal with the effort to resuscitate the economy, the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Public Works Administration and so on. And he realized he had all these people reporting to him, but he had no staff. He had basically 3 primary aides: somebody who handled his schedule, somebody who handled his press relations, and somebody who was just handled everything else. And so he appointed this committee, and he said, you need to devise a plan to strengthen my managerial capacities, my ability to manage this growing executive branch. And so the Brownlow Committee issued a very important report. Came out in 1937. Don't worry too much about all this words. Basically, it was 5 points. 1, you need to modernize the White House by expanding it. 2, strengthen the budget and efficiency research, your control over planning, your control over personnel in the executive branch. 3rd, reorganize the whole government, in part by making sure that people who are appointed to political positions are appointed on the basis of merit, under civil service protection as opposed to who you know. Reorganize the government to, and don't worry too much about this, but basically they wanted to make sure that agencies that were handling the same functions were all housed in the same department. They wanted to rationalize. And make the executive branch accountable to Congress by creating a position to audit financial transactions. So it was all dressed up in basically jargon of public administration. But this was the most crucial one: modernizing the White House. Roosevelt gets this set of recommendations, and he acts on it by creating formally what's known today as the Executive Office of the President, formally established by executive order in 1939. And it consists of a formal White House office, which I'm going to concentrate on today. The Bureau of the Budget, now called the Office of Management of Budget, was moved into this executive office, and a couple of other agencies that you don't need to know about. Again, the important point here is this is the origins of the White House staff, that famous staff that we know so much about today. And I'm not even going to spend too much time here. These are essentially the executive office of the president was going to provide the president with staff help to help him coordinate the actions of the executive branch cabinet departments, help the president manage the major activities, budgeting, putting together an annual budget, personnel, who do I hire, what kind of personnel guidelines control hiring to the executive branch, and policy planning. What type of legislation do we need over the long term? And the idea here is the people who would work on the presidential staff weren't going to be political hacks. They were going to be careerists who would develop expertise, and they would serve from presidency to presidency. And there would also be the White House office. But the White House office was not viewed as going to be a very important part of this executive office of the president. In fact, it was supposed to be basically the president's eyes, ears, and legs. A very small group of generalists. They wouldn't specialize in anything. They would mostly be gophers. And by small, he meant no more than 6 additional executive assistants to supplement the roughly 3 to 5 he had. So we're talking maybe 10 to 12 senior assistants who would go out and they would be presidential gophers. They would go out to the Treasury Department or the Defense Department. They find out what's going on, and they would bring intelligence back to the president. And most important, they would have a passion for anonymity. Say that word twice. That is, you would never see them on talk show hosts. Nobody would be making fun of them on Saturday Night Live. They would be behind the scenes. If you wanted somebody to represent the presidency, it wouldn't be the White House staff. It'd be your cabinet secretaries and so on. That was the idea behind the Brownlow Committee report as implemented by Roosevelt. And like most good ideas in government, it does not exist today, right? Today's White House violates all those precepts. That small staff of about a dozen senior, the White House now numbers more than 500 aides, of which we're going to talk about in just a moment. Roughly 20 to 25 are really senior. Rather than being generalists, they're very functionally specialized. Rather than being a single layer of advisors that the president interacts with daily, he knows everybody in the White House, he knows what they're doing. It's now hierarchically arranged so that there are multiple layers. Presidents often don't even know who's working in the White House for them down at the lower bowels. And the president, therefore, can't manage the White House staff. Roosevelt used to hold daily staff meetings. Newstad for Harry Truman. Truman would have everyone come in the Oval Office and sit around his table. Now that job is delegated to a chief of staff, Reince Priebus, right now. And perhaps most importantly, White House aides are distinctly not anonymous. We know them. They're frequently on talk shows. More controversially, they're frequently in trouble. And I'll talk about this. So let me really just briefly go through, what do I mean by large? Here's the end of World War II. Roosevelt's staff, roughly about 200 people. Most of those people were clerical aides, secretaries, manning typewriters. And it gradually grew until under Nixon it peaked at almost 900 individuals. Now, as a result of Watergate, presidents have pared that back. It's pretty consistently been about 500 individuals. And that's what it is currently under Donald Trump. And this includes the White House office, also the National Security Staff, which I will talk about, and a couple of other individuals. So it's large. We're talking about 500 individuals. Of those 500 individuals, about half come in with the president, 250 or so. We call those commissioned officers. All a commission means is you get a formal document that says your job includes the words "to the president" in your title. That's a commissioned role, and it's supposed to signify your importance. If you're a non-commissioned aide, you're getting paid less, and you're not in a policy or politically important position. You're probably a clerical or technical aide, and you report to somebody who has the phrase "to the president." So for this talk, I'm going to mostly focus on commissioned officers, right? The ones whose titles include the phrase "to the president." And they are listed in the U.S. government manual, which is produced every year. And this is the percentage over here of total White House staff that have this title. And you can see it varies from a high of a quarter of the staff down to almost 7 or 8%. Most recently, through Bush and Obama, about 10% of the White House staff have titles, but we can see it's gone up to 30% under Clinton. And again, that's mostly partly a matter of the functions, what you do, how important they are, but also political preference. The president doesn't have to give you this title. And there are some limits on who can get the title based on budgeting. I won't bore you with the details. But the most important thing here is that, and again, this is another way of slicing the numbers. These are the total number of individuals for each president who were commissioned. So not the percentage, but the number of staff members listed. And the reason Clinton has so many is he just churned through a whole bunch of staff, and he served 2 terms. But again, you can see the number of commissioned aides generally has gone up in recent years. The presidency's White House staff has become somewhat top-heavy. And again, this is where the focus of my second book is. Most of my data pertains to these leaders. Most of my interviews with White House staff are with these individuals. All right, why did it get bigger? Supply and demand. First, we've had changes to how campaigns are run. Increasingly, and I won't bore you with this, but a very famous reform took place in the 1970s that altered the way that presidents ran their campaigns. Essentially, they rely less on the party to provide expertise and infrastructure and more to put together their own campaign staff. Donald Trump is a great example. No Republican wanted Donald Trump to win the nomination. He sort of put together his own staff. And so once you're elected, what do you do with those staff members? They want jobs. So you stick them in the White House. Turns out this is a problem because governing is not at all like campaigning, as Steve Bannon and Steve Miller and Kellyanne Conway are finding out right now. So partly we got all these staffers we have to put somewhere. Second, the things that we do in the White House used to be done elsewhere. So it used to be that if I wanted to know whether I could get the votes to repeal Obamacare, I would go to the equivalent of Lyndon Johnson or Sam Rayburn and say, Sam, Lyndon, do I have the votes to repeal Obamacare? And they would give you an accurate head count. Congress has changed. Congress has become much more decentralized. Nobody can control the House Freedom Caucus. So we're often not sure about the president's legislative prospects. So the presidents have put together their own legislative staff who do those functions. And that's the same with dealing with the party, with the media, and so on. In short, the White House has grown larger because presidents increasingly don't trust these outside groups to provide them with that information that I talked about that was so important for them for judging their power prospects. So they bring people into the White House. So the White House has gotten larger, and it's a function of supply and demand. Not only has it gotten larger, but it is increasingly top-heavy in the sense these are, now this is somewhat misleading because this is just the percentage of your White House staff that comes from the campaign staff. In raw numbers, the number of campaign staff is much bigger over here. That's because the staffs here are smaller. But you can see the campaigns provide a good chunk of a president's staff. The other thing that has really become a huge source of, in terms of supply, is the number of aides that come from Congress, have congressional experience, not necessarily members of Congress, but as staff. And again, this is a percentage. Not surprisingly, Barack Obama, who had very little congressional experience, really brought in a lot of legislative aides to help him get his legislative program through. So this is the supply side. Interestingly enough, the percentage of aides who work in the public sector has actually declined from a high under FDR and Truman, declined in the 60s into the 70s. It's now gone up slightly. Obama, again, was on the high end. You're noticing I don't have any data on Trump yet because my research assistants all left. They graduated. So I haven't been able to update this. All right, so the White House staff has gotten bigger. It's also functionally specialized. These are the titles of the various offices within the White House. I'm not going to go through them right now, but I will break these down into three basic functions. And I'll talk about that. And I mentioned earlier the hierarchy. It's a 4-level hierarchy. There's a chief of staff who ostensibly makes sure the trains run on time. He usually has a couple of deputy assistants. There's a bunch of other assistants to the president. This would be the Steve Bannons and the Jared Kushners. And then below them, they usually have their own deputies. And at the very bottom are the SAPs, the special assistant to the president. And again, the titles can vary somewhat, but these are all the commissioned aides. And why do I care about hierarchy? It means there's a lot of people running around with White House commissions saying, I'm talking on behalf of the president. The president doesn't even know who they are, right? For the most part. What does the White House staff do? 3 things. One, the care and feeding of the president. His daily schedule is put together through the staff. His appointments are controlled by the staff. His travel, advance, is controlled by the staff. That's care and feeding. The most important person, care and feeding, is the chief of staff. His job, again, as I said, is to make sure all these moving parts are synchronized. And it's very important that he has the confidence of the president and he can say no to the president. Why do I mention that? Because Reince Priebus has none of these. From what we can see, he does not have Trump's confidence and he cannot say no to Donald Trump and have Trump listen. It's not clear Donald Trump listens to anybody. We'll talk about that problem. Second, policy development. Increasingly, the president with his own White House staffs are the source of policy. We sort of take that for granted, but that was not always the case, right? This really is a relatively recent development, as I'm going to show you. And third, outreach to key constituencies. Public, Congress, the press, interest groups. You have White House staff members whose job is to nurture these relationships, to report back to the president when anyone is unhappy, and to sell the president's program to these key constituents. That's primarily what the White House staff does. Now, if you want to look at this growth that I talked about very early, what drives this? It isn't the care and feeding of the president. It's outreach, it's policy development. And I'll show you some data on this before we get. All right. So here's the current care and feeding staff. I'm breaking down these functions. This is the Donald Trump staff. The most important, of course, is the chief of staff. He has a couple of deputies. The cabinet secretary, whose job is to organize cabinet meetings and staff them out. This guy, poor Rob Porter, his job working with Priebus is trying to make sure that any memo that goes into the president goes through proper channels. One of the big problems the Trump administration is having is people like Ivanka and Jared can meet with Trump outside the White House, and they can say, by the way, you ought to, well, in Ivanka's case, you ought to stay in the Paris climate change treaty. And they can give memos there. What you want to do in a properly run White House is any memo the president reads first is circulated among all your relevant cabinet agencies and your aides. And it's stamped right on top with a routing memo that says these people have seen it. And any comments they might have are stapled to that policy document before it gets to Donald Trump's. That's what Rob Porter's job is as staff secretary. He's being ignored. From what we can tell, people are slipping things into Donald Trump. And the problem is sometimes they're slipping things in. Somebody slipped in a story about how we were entering an ice age. And Trump got all excited about this and began tweeting, and it turned out to be fake news. But someone had just slipped it in and it hadn't been verified or anything like this. So it's sort of a losing cause. But that's the care and feeding. The second group, the policy staff, Steve Bannon is the chief strategist and senior counselor. But the other senior White House policy advisor is Jared Kushner. I'm going to talk about them more. And in addition, you have these councils. The National Security Council you've all heard of, but they have an economic and a domestic counterpart. And this is the innovation of Trump, a trade council. What do those councils do? They are generally councils of the relevant cabinet departments that meet under the guise of this White House assistant. So Gary Cohn will meet with the Treasury Secretary, the Office of Management and Budget, Commerce Secretary, and he will put together tax reform. But it'll all be orchestrated by the White House staff. So the White House staff is leading these councils. We also have one on Homeland Security, and the Director of National Intelligence is not really technically part of the White House staff. Third group is the political outreach people. Again, the most important one, Sean Spicer. He's the communications director. Maybe many of you saw him give a press conference today. A lot of rumors that he's going to be replaced by this woman, Kellyanne Conway. She was a key strategist in the campaign. And she basically is a White House office, but it's not clear what she does. She made a couple of statements that turned out to be factually incorrect, and she's sort of been shunned. So she's working behind the scenes. This poor guy, Dan Scavino, he's social media director. That means ostensibly he's in charge of Donald Trump's tweets. The reality is he has no control over Donald Trump's tweets. Donald Trump tweets what he wants to tweet when he wants to tweet at 3 a.m. And so poor Dan Scavino is left sort of picking up the scraps. But that's a relatively new office, social media director. And the only other person of interest here, The Director of Communications for the Office of Public Liaison, reaching out for important interest groups, is this person, Omarosa. Does anybody know who Omarosa is? Who is Omarosa? Yes, she was on Celebrity Apprentice, although before she was a celebrity. That's how she qualified to work in the White House, right? The Celebrity Apprentice. All right, the policy staff has really grown. Roosevelt and Truman had no policy staff. How did they put together the New Deal? Working with cabinet agencies, right? That is increasingly being centralized within the White House. So a big driving force behind that growth of the White House staff is that increasingly the president is expected and encouraged to develop in-house his own White House policy proposals. And so you can see roughly 30% of the White House staff now consists of policy people. Same for outreach. We had an increasing proportion of staff devoted to political outreach, nurturing these other constituencies that are crucial for a president's electoral coalition, but also for mobilizing support for the president's policies. And again, you can see Roosevelt and Truman and Eisenhower had no outreach, but that has grown dramatically, in large part reflecting changes to communication. So we've seen these technological developments that have allowed the president to nurture via communication a lot of his political support. Social media is just the latest frontier here. But before that, there was television, cable news, and now we're into sort of the internet and social media. Roughly a third of the White House is dealing with communications. What is not growing is the internal care and feeding, which was so crucial to the Brownlow report and what Roosevelt envisioned his White House staff to be all about, people who basically work for him. That has grown increasingly smaller as a percentage of the overall White House staff. So why has the White House staff got bigger? Growth in policy staff, growth in communications staff, right? And both reflecting, so if we just want to put this on a single graph, you can see policy staff growing. Again, the y-axis here is the percentage of total staff. The blue is your administrations and operation. That's getting smaller. And again, your political outreach. So they're roughly a third devoted to each of those functions in the modern era. And again, I'm just sort of giving you some background before we get into the details of Trump. Another way to look at this, I had my research assistant put together a composite based on the functions of the White House staff from Herbert Hoover all the way up midway through Barack Obama. And the two things I want you to, these are the gophers, the general purpose, the black. The way the White House was intended to run according to Brownlow and Roosevelt. And you can see under Roosevelt, a good chunk of his staff were gophers. No longer. And that reflects the increasing specialization by function of the staff. Second development here, the development of policy. That's the orange right there. And the national security staff. And this small here is the chief of staff. This purple is the upper level coordination, right? And then again, this is the blue is the sort of the administration. So it sort of graphically shows you what has been growing more important over a century and what has sort of decreased in importance. Okay, a couple other things that I just thought might be interesting. You want to work in the White House? Have to have high energy levels. White House work weeks, I remember going in, interviewing individuals and a staff. Most of them were single, or if they weren't, they soon would be single. They worked routinely 80-hour work weeks. It's just a hellish condition. And so you really have to be young for the most part. Senior level staff can be a little bit higher, but when you get down to those, the SAPs, special assistants, they're in their 20s and 30s. It's scary. You know, my students, some of them have gone in here and worked at the lower levels of the White House. They can barely pass my course, and they're out running the country. Right? The other thing is they're usually much younger than the president. Again, this is somewhat a function of how old the president is. So not surprisingly, the biggest age gap was between Reagan and his staff, roughly 35-year age gap. Smallest ones, not surprisingly, JFK and Clinton, who were very young. But usually there's about a 10-year gap between the president and his aides. And again, I'm generalizing, generally speaking, the more senior you are in the White House, the older you are, the more experienced you are. And as you go down to the lower level, the younger you are. The one other thing I will point out, working in the White House staff increasingly is a short-term proposition. This is for a number of reasons. One is we are increasingly recruiting campaign staffers, and it turns out they're not very good at governing. And so, as Donald Trump is finding out, very early in presidents' administrations, they tend to overhaul their White House staff. Bill Clinton did this, Bush and Obama less so. There are a lot of rumors that Trump's White House staff is going to undergo an overhaul. So what I've done here basically is I calculated how long, let me step back. I calculated the percentage of White House staff in any one year who are retained in the next year. These lower ones are change of administration, so don't pay any attention to those. Obviously, very few are retained when you switch presidencies. But the general trend has been increasing turnover, that is, decreasing stability. And that is also a reflection of it's just harder to work in the White House. The White House glare, the ethics violations, it's just not a very fun job. And finally, you can make a lot of money by working in the White House a short term and then leaving and writing a kiss and tell book. So all these things have sort of conspired to increase turnover in the White House. All right. How do you know who's most important in the White House? 3 words: location, location, location. There are big, huge, ornate offices with wonderful Romanesque columns across Old Executive Avenue in the old Executive Office building. Do you want to work there in those big offices? You do not. You want to work in a shoe-sized closet, as long as that shoe-sized closet is in the West Wing. So all your senior advisors are located in the West Wing. This is the West Wing. Teddy Roosevelt basically created that. There are 2 floors. There's actually a basement as well. And there's a media portion off here. So this is the first floor. Typically, the chief of staff is there, the vice president there, national security advisor there, your communications staff is there, and you usually have senior advisors there. In the second area, you usually have your press people, the lower level press people, your interest liaison, your congressional liaison. So I will give you a sense of, again, White House. There's usually a study here. This is where you hang out with your interns, right here. That's known as the Lewinsky office, right? Yeah, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say, I don't know why I do that. That's horrible. So now you got to reorient yourself because I couldn't get the slide oriented right. So now here's the Oval Office. These are his primary personal aides. Oh my Lord, I'm blanking on them. Hayden, you know anybody's personal aides? No, I'm blanking on them. Okay, never mind. But the 2 senior aides vying for influence, Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon, right next to Obama. Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus. Vice President, whoops. He's not there. That's Mike Flynn. He's been replaced by H.R. McMaster. And then you have your communications people over here. Kellyanne stuck up here. That's the White House legal counsel. That's Richard Dearborn, who deals with policy. That's Gary Cohn, policy. I've got no idea who that guy is. That's the key to the real estate. So obviously the most influential people are the ones right next to the White House the Oval Office, or the people who have to deal with him because they're doing scheduling appointments. Typically, you cannot get into the White House until you go through these people. But guess what? Into the Oval Office, going through these people. So you have to go through this door here rather than just walking in through the corridor. But guess what? He gets to see the president anytime he wants, which is... Ivanka's on the 2nd floor, sorry. This was made before she had ethics problems. They had to decide whether she was going to get an official title as a White House. If she did, she had to go through security protocol. And they weren't sure. So what they did was they reserved a 2nd floor office for her, but she didn't actually move in at the time this was taken. She eventually decided to pass the security clearance, but to take no money. So she's not getting paid, even though she is de facto a White House assistant. She has promised to abide by all ethics rules and regulations. But it's, it's a very ethical gray area here when you have members of your own family working for you in a White House staff capacity. Some of you will recall we had these same conversations when Bill Clinton was elected and said, we're electing 2 for the price of 1. I'm going to put my wife in charge of policy. Well, the difficulty, again, is you can't fire these people if they're doing a bad job, although Bill did his hardest to try to sever his relationship with Hillary. But that's another story. So Ivanka is there. She's on the 2nd floor. Good question. All right, let's talk Trump. How are we doing on time? Okay. I'd like to cut this off at 50 minutes if I could. Right now, as far as we can tell, again, this is all sort of based on sources that you have access to, so I'm not giving you any inside baseball here. I have a couple individuals who I'm very close to working in the Trump White House. I have to be very careful how I describe them because they both told me they would shoot me if I ever revealed who they were. I have done interviews with them, so I'm going to sort of give you some information, but they are no means senior, and that's about all I can tell you, okay? So based on their interviews and what I'm reading in the paper, there are 3 power centers in the current Trump White House. There's the Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, who ostensibly is in charge of managing the whole system. There is Senior Advisor and Strategist Steve Bannon. He earned his spurs on the campaign trail. He basically resuscitated Trump's campaign. Of course, you know him as Breitbart News, a senior executive, sort of a right-wing mouthpiece for the alternative right. And then Jared Kushner, a businessman who basically was almost unheard of during the campaign, but it turned out he had a data-driven campaign team that was hauled away and just sort of ran circles around the Clinton people, from what we can see. Just a brilliant campaign strategist. But what's interesting about these individuals is none of them have any governing experience whatsoever. And here they are, the 3 most important person in the Trump White House. And from what we understand, based on interviews, they hate each other. These people do not get along. That's not necessarily a problem. That's not a prerequisite for an effective White House staff. But it can help smooth over some policy differences if you actually like the person you're disagreeing with. But apparently they do not. Reince, of course, is smiling. It's the last time a picture of him smiling. He is not a happy camper. By all intents and purposes, his job is a living hell because he cannot get his boss to follow the protocol for doing anything. And nobody really listens to him. And so every other week there's a rumor that he's on the way out. And the latest interviews with dozen Trump administration officials and advisors suggest few expect him to be long for the White House. He's considered by some a lame duck chief of staff, soon to be reassigned. A friend said it's basically decided that he's gone. It's just a matter of who replaces him. He has told others he knows changes need to be made in the West Wing, but it's difficult to control Trump, who had built his career on making brash decisions. Priebus does not have the ability to walk in the Oval Office, close the door, and tell Trump what he wants to hear. This would not be the first time this has happened. Many of you will remember Bill Clinton hired his boyhood friend, a man named Mac McClarty, to be his chief of staff. Wonderful individual, totally ill-suited for controlling Clinton. Clinton was just a wild child in the White House. He would hold these policy meetings until 1 a.m., make a decision, change his mind at 7 a.m. And they finally had to bring in a guy named Leon Panetta, who could sort of crack the whip and bring some order. Presumably this is what's going to happen again in the next few weeks. Priebus is probably going to be removed. Although it's not clear to me that anybody wants to take this job when you have to work for Donald Trump, who, as far as we can see, seems incapable of self-discipline. Second power center, this guy, Steve Bannon. I remember showing this picture to somebody who said, oh, he's drunk. That's why his eyes are always red. I don't know if you can tell that. He's the senior counselor and chief White House strategist. He epitomizes everything that's good about the White House and everything that's bad. Presidents love the White House because there's no confirmation, You can put anybody in there you want. Nobody can prevent you from doing that. And so you know these people are going to be loyal to you. Steve Bannon is loyal, and he was one of those few people who believed in Trump during the campaign when everyone said Trump was going to lose. And Trump won and rewards him by giving him a job as chief White House strategist and even initially a seat on the National Security Council, which raised a few eyebrows, right? Here's the problem. Just because you're loyal doesn't mean you're competent, right? His worldview is described as economic nationalism. His basic goal is to deconstruct the administrative state. Not everybody agrees with his policies. Kushner is the one who's pushing back at him, so much so that Bannon was recently removed from the National Security Panel, reportedly under pressure from Kushner. More generally, he screwed up very early on. He pushed the Muslim ban, and he did so apparently without even clearing it with the White House legal counsel. And this was an illustration of how loyalty can get trumped over the long term, no pun intended, by incompetence. There's no guarantee that just because you're a great campaign strategist, when you're on the campaign, issues are black and white. You're either for the president or against him. There's no gray areas. There's no subtleties. That's not like governing, right? You know, the famous Mario Cuomo statement, right? You campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. Bannon, great at poetry, not so good at prose. And we're finding that out now. Trump is finding that out now. His assistant, Stephen Miller, was behind, again, this bungled out role of Trump's first statement at a travel ban, and his wings have been clipped as well. Third, power center. And this guy was on the rise, and for some stupid reason, I had this feeling that this guy would be the voice of reason, speaking into the president's ear, speaking to his better angels. But it has increasingly become clear that all the problems that afflict a former businessman like Donald Trump when he tries to run the White House the same way he ran his businesses also seem to afflict Jared Kushner. Why should we be surprised? He's also basically a businessman. And so he has been behind many of the decisions that Trump has made that have turned out not to be so very smart. He is the secretary of everything. The president, according to a number of reports, has put him in charge of negotiating peace in the Middle East, his Israeli connections, dealing with the opioid epidemic. I wouldn't be surprised if he's out there right now. Diplomacy with Mexico and China, reforming the criminal justice system. He's pretty much doing everything, and apparently has some nice business deals going with the Russians as well. Those are the three power centers. Beneath them, of course, they have their own deputies and special assistants, and they're all sort of jockeying for power within the White House. Now, keep in mind, having competing power centers isn't a bad thing, right? Franklin Roosevelt specialized in this. I'm going to show you, I wrote a book about how Roosevelt utilized competing power centers. But you have to have a very talented chief executive who knows how to balance off these opinions, as opposed to Trump, who seems to listen to the last person who talked to him, as opposed to balancing these different opinions off. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. But there's Mrs. Jared Kushner, better known as Ivanka Trump. She was supposed to be the voice of reason. As I said, she's an unpaid government employee. She's close to her husband. She was supposed to be a moderating voice inside the West Wing. Her focus was on issues like women's health, equal pay, affordable child care. Her top aide, Dina Powell, has now been promoted to the National Security Council. Problem, it's not clear that the president actually listens to her. So she was telling him, don't pull out of Paris. And evidently, her advice didn't carry much weight there. A couple of other subsidiary people, I mentioned them just because they've got a lot of time. Yeah. That's Sean Spicer. He's the communications director and press secretary. He's been in hot water in day one. Talking to one of my sources in there, he said, I don't even understand how the guy got hired. Trump likes handsome people in the White House. He's not handsome. He's so not handsome that Melissa McCarthy plays him on Saturday Night Live skits. I don't know how many of you stay up late enough to watch Saturday Night Live, but there's a running gag where Melissa McCarthy is actually playing Sean Spicer, and it's absolutely hilarious. You have to see some of these. What's that? Yeah, just if you don't want to watch the original show, just get the YouTube videos. Here she is. She's been informed, he has been informed that he's going to be removed, so he leaves the White House and takes his podium up to Manhattan to meet with the president to beg his case. They actually filmed this on the streets of Manhattan, Melissa McCarthy. And of course, his daily press briefings have become appointment viewing for Democrats and Republicans. It's also opened him up to rampant criticism and wanton speculation about his hold on the job. And his problem, of course, is his guardian angel is Reince Priebus. And if Reince is on his way out, Spicer won't be far behind. And again, a lot of these people have problems, the non-Trump side of things, because during the campaign they frequently mocked Trump because, after all, he's never going to win the presidency. And now suddenly have to deal with it. The other interesting person is Kellyanne Conway. Kellyanne proved to be a brilliant campaign strategist, so much so that Saturday Night Live began to incorporate her character in as sort of this Wonder Woman who, every time Donald Trump dropped a turd, she would be there cleaning it up with some masterful public relations. Unfortunately for her, it has not translated into the White House. She got in hot water by making a couple of factually challenged statements very early on. And again, anytime a lead character on Saturday Night Live is playing you, that's probably not good news. So this is Kate McKinnon, who does a wonderful Kellyanne Conway. If you hadn't seen the last one, in which she stalks Jake Tapper, the guy playing Jake Tapper, and basically holds a knife to his throat to get her back on the talk shows, you have to Google that, YouTube that one. It's just great. And of course, there are rumors that she's after, since she has nothing to do now, since Trump is his own communications guy, she wants to handle the daily press briefings. She's said to be eyeing the White House podium by ending Sean Spicer's job. All right, let me finish up with some speculations here. So, if you have been following the news, about every week there is a leak from an unnamed source saying Trump is on the brink of overhauling his White House staff. And this has led a lot of opinion leaders to speculate on what's going to happen. This is David Brooks. We have seen White Houses engulfed by scandal before, but we have never seen a White House implode before it had the time to staff up. The Nixon, Reagan, and Clinton White Houses had hired quality teams by the time their scandals came. They could continue to function. The Trump administration, on the other hand, has hundreds of senior and mid-level positions to fill. Few people of quality or experience are going to want to take them. So one problem they're having is hiring people. I mean, one of the reasons my colleague doesn't want me to tell you who he is he's afraid his career will be ruined once people know that he was sort of working in the Trump White House. They're having problems hiring people, staffing up at the lower levels in particular. But the real problem here may not be the staff. Privately, and again, this is an unnamed source in the Washington Post, it's not incompetent communication shop, as the president gripes, or an ineffective chief of staff, his friends and outside operatives repeatedly warn. It's the man in the Oval Office whose preferred management style is one of competing factions and organized chaos. And it is not easy to overhaul your White House staff. First, to do so is to admit you made mistakes, right? And Donald Trump, more than most presidents, has difficulty acknowledging that. Although in the Mike Flynn case, he was very quick to pull the trigger. But there are going to be political costs if you're going to shake up the White House. It happens, right? Barack Obama essentially took a little longer, but never got along with Rambo Emanuel and eventually moved him out. Emanuel wanted to get out. Second, you got to replace them with people. Who wants the job? Who would ever take Reince Priebus's job without the stature or the authority to actually manage the White House, right? And that's the third problem here. This is not a normal president in the sense that you feel like his interests align with your interests as a White House staffer, in that you want to see this thing run properly, right? How do you manage the Twitter-in-chief? Again, Scavino. He was a former caddy at one of Trump's golf courses. That qualified him to run his Twitter, right?
He helped Trump hone his reach on social media that helped the reality TV star command media attention in the campaign. Once again, a lesson here. What works in the campaign doesn't necessarily work in the White House. Moreover, sources with knowledge tell CNN Scavino doesn't actually have control of, this is his Twitter handle, @RealDonaldTrump. Scavino claims that he does, but I'm betting that he does not based on what I'm seeing from Trump's Twitter. By the way, how many here are on Twitter? None of you? Excellent. Okay. I don't recommend it. It's a huge time sink, but it's mildly entertaining to get tweets from the President of the United States. I mean, this is unheard of. We've never had a president who on a daily basis tells you exactly what he's thinking, right? Without any filter whatsoever, right? It's as if he called you up on the phone and said, Matt, I don't understand what we're doing in the Middle East. I'm going to fire everybody. What do you think, right? Of course, it fits his communication style because on Twitter, everything has to be within 140 characters, which is pretty much the length of one of his policy statements or his attention span, right? About 140 characters. So Priebus, as I talked about before, and his White House staff secretary have tried to implement a system to manage and document the paperwork Trump receives. But as one White House official said, I'm not sure anyone follows it, particularly Kushner and Trump, who can give the president any paperwork they want outside the White House system because they can just go into the residence, have dinner with the president, and say, by the way, here's this policy I've just drafted on dealing with Putin. And Trump will read it and say, that's great. Let's tweet it and make it law, right? So don't worry about the episode. But the problem here is managing a White House led by an impetuous president who has resisted structure and strictures his entire life. While the information stream to past commander-in-chiefs has been monitored, Trump prefers an open Oval Office with a free flow of ideas and inputs from both official and unofficial channels. Again, in theory, this is great. I mean, one of the problems we've had in previous presidents is they've been closed off from information, and they've surrounded themselves with one source of information, loyalists. Trump takes advice from anybody, or rejects advice from anybody, right? But there's no sense that he can differentiate good advice from bad advice. Moreover, the advice is coming to him unfiltered. It's not structured in a way that he can play some advice off other advice. So his advising system is not helping him at this point, right? And the consequences, I can tell you, this is what I study, can be tremendous. According to a half dozen White House officials with direct interaction with the president, a news story tucked into Trump's hands, his tiny hands, at the right moment can torpedo an appointment or redirect the president's entire agenda. Who can rescue him? He needs someone with the stature and security to walk in the Oval Office, close the door, and tell the president what he needs to hear. And according to Brent Brudowski, if he doesn't, his presidency is going to be a failure. But let me finish with this one point. Why I forced you to look at sort of all that historical stuff. Partly what we're seeing here is a more fundamental problem in governing through an enlarged White House staff. The White House staff does some things very well. It provides clerical support that a president needs. He cannot do his daily job without somebody guarding his door, handling his correspondence, setting his long-term schedule up, and so on. All the things the Brownlow Committee recommended that Roosevelt needed. But there are some structural weaknesses built into the White House, and this is sort of what my research focuses on. How can presidents overcome this? One is the White House tends to reward loyalty over competence. And again, it's understandable why, but it doesn't necessarily help you once you're in office. Two, the White House staff tends to be focusing on the short term. What's Jake Tapper saying on the news today, right? How can we handle this particular fire? Let's put this out. Let's deal with the Russia scandal. And when you are spending all your time focusing on a 24-hour news cycle, you are ignoring long-term trends, long-term problems that are on the horizon that eventually will become your concern. So it's not a very proactive environment. It's not an environment that plans ahead very well. It rewards short-term firefighting, putting out the immediate political controversy. Presidents and their staffs are prisoners of first things first, not first things are what my priorities should be. It's what I have to deal with. Third, this layering of the loyalist means those careerists who have often served through 2 or 3 or 4 presidents, their advice does not reach the president. Or if it does reach the president, it is sort of like a game of telephone. It's distorted by the political loyalists by the time it gets there. And we see this again and again on Trump's decisions, right? So the Muslim ban. There were careerists who could have told him that there are ways to put this together that will pass legal muster. But as far as we can tell, they were cut out of the entire decision-making process. Or in dealing with this this dispute between Saudi Arabia and Qatar right now. There are State Department officials, and Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, if you've heard him, has sort of been very careful about not taking sides here, because we have an Air Force base in Qatar, but Saudi Arabia is a longtime rival, so Tillerson is saying all the right things about mediating this dispute. Then what happens? Donald Trump issues a tweet that says, boy, those Saudis are right. Then Qatar, they're the source of ISIS. And you've undercut your own Secretary of State and the careerists, right? This is a problem. And the increasing specialization of advisors within the White House means they are less likely to see things from the president's vantage point. From this, what I'm saying is the president isn't only worried about economic policy or political policy or national. He has to worry about all of them, putting them together. But when your advisors are only thinking through one particular narrow lens, their advice to you tends to be colored by their specialty. On the one hand, that's good. They have expertise that you can draw on. On the other hand, that expertise might be divorced from your broader political implications. So my point here is a lot of what we're seeing with the Trump White House, roughly 140 days in, is self-inflicted wounds by Trump, compounded by a relatively inexperienced staff, senior staff members who have never had any experience at governing, but some of it reflects problems more deeply rooted in relying on the White House staff as your primary source of advice. And it is not likely to be completely cured just by bringing in new White House advisors. I've given you a capsule summary, but if you're interested in a little more detail, I recommend this book, a great stocking stuffer. Historical problems, this is my takeaway. The historical problems associated with the White House staff have been exacerbated by this man, Donald Trump. Questions? And I take questions about anything. Sue, I'm sorry.
A couple of microphones that go around, so we'll bring them to you.
Okay. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We got lots of questions.
Matt, it's easy to, I'm here.
Where are you? Raise your hand.
It's on. Okay.
Okay. Oh, I see you. Yes.
It's easy to make fun of Trump and what's going on around him. I guess I have so many questions, but the main one is, how much of a danger is this to our nation? I mean, it's really not funny.
Well, you're right, and I'm those of students who have the unfortunate experience of having me as a professor realize I can pretty much make fun of anything. If there'd be a nuclear war, I'd see the humor in it. It's not always a good thing. So you're absolutely right. I mean, I sort of chide in a humorous way about having Donald Trump as president. But really, what are the consequences? And I would say a couple of things. One is, you remember the frustration many of you had that Barack Obama couldn't get anything done? Right? And you said, oh, if only this guy had more power. And I would give talks and say, no, our system of government is not designed to enhance the president's power to make it easier for presidents to get things done. It's designed to limit the ability of those in authority to inflict things on us that we may not like having done. That's the way our system is designed, right? In the famous words of my mentor, political scientist Richard Neustadt, we have a system of separated institutions sharing power. And we hate that when the guy in office is somebody that we elected to do things, right? But we have a trade-off in our system. And the trade-off is this. When the guy we didn't elect is in office and trying to do things, it's really hard for him to do things as well. So what I would tell you is, if we get beyond sort of the humorous or not so humorous things that Donald Trump has said, what has he actually done? Not a lot. Not a lot. He's pulled us out of the Paris Accords, but that's going to take about 4 years to implement, right? He's issued a couple of executive orders. Those have both been stymied by the courts. He's tried to get Obamacare repealed. Second try, got it repealed through the House, but it's still got to go through the Senate. Unlikely to do that. So for all the bluster and the rhetoric and your fear, this guy has proved singularly incapable of really doing anything that has any long-term consequences, if you ignore sort of the Russian connection, which is spinning off there on its side, and we don't know. So I understand your fear, but here's where the wisdom of the framers shows through, right? We have a system. I mean, if I asked you, if I embarrassed Hayden, one of my students who's sitting in the front row here, and asked him to stand up and tell you, or I revoke his degree, what the takeaway message from this book is, what do you think Hayden would say? Hayden, what would you say?
Why don't we give them an answer?
Okay. The takeaway message is the presidency is weak. And it is weak because the framers designed it that way. And it remains the case that outside of crises, 9/11, Cuban Missile Crisis, which generally elevate the presidency in the short term, presidents can't do a lot in this system. I don't know if that reassures you, but we shouldn't get sort of distracted by Trump's efforts to distract us with his tweets and the Saturday Night Live. Focus on what he's able to do. It's very difficult for presidents to do things both that benefit us, but also which might hurt us.
Before things get worse, and he does succeed in doing awful things, who do you think can beat him, Republican or Democrat, the next election?
So if we think generically about the elections, one thing we know, the question was who can beat him in the next election. One thing we know, it's very difficult for a first-term president, that first term that is of a party, to lose re-election. If you think in the modern era, presidents who were elected and who failed to win re-election, you can count on one finger the number, right? Or two fingers, really. Well, one, actually. Jimmy Carter, right? Well, George Herbert Walker Bush was the third Republican term. So this is my point. When a party has just come in, they almost never lose re-election. So if I was a betting man right now, I'd say Donald Trump is in for 8 years, just based on history. Yeah, I know. But that's just thinking about presidents generically. Now, Donald Trump may be a singular case that operates under his own laws. Part of the Democratic problem is they invested so much time in a few, particularly Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, is they don't have a very deep bench. There's not a lot of young Democrats out there with national stature. Having said that, at this time in 2005, nobody heard of Barack Obama either. So there's a lot of time for somebody to develop a reputation. I don't know who that is, Cory Booker. You know, I've heard lots of different names raised up the flagpole. I'm not clear who's saluting at this stage, but there's plenty of time for the Democrats to coalesce around somebody. But it's almost certain that Donald Trump will be the Republican nominee and the odds-on favorite to win re-election, barring a scandal, right? If this Russian connection goes somewhere, all bets are off.
Question. In describing this structure of the White House, it doesn't seem like there's very much of it, if any of it, that is oriented towards dealing with the Congress.
So they have a couple of ways in which they deal with the Congress. They have a staff under a guy, I didn't show you the guy's name. The guy is Mark Short. He is Trump's legislative liaison, and he's in charge of a couple of deputy assistants who deal with the Senate and a couple more who deal with the House. And their job is to nurture sort of ongoing relationships with the individual members of Congress to sort of sound out how receptive they will be to the president's proposals. But most of those relationships are taking place at the very senior level between Trump, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell. They're sort of if there's any type of key strategy choices going on, they're dealing with it at the senior level. It's not clear to me how much interaction Kushner
or Bannon has with members of Congress. I just don't think they're that experienced. They haven't built up the network. Whereas under Obama, most of his dealings with Congress went through Rahm Emanuel, who had vast experience and had been in the House. So you're right to note that. It's mostly because there are no senior staff who really got those close ties.
Even though he may be, the presidency is weak, isn't Trump doing a lot to reduce the influence of America in the world by doing what he's doing?
Well, so it certainly symbolically, you know, one of the, when people talk about Barack Obama, one of the very interesting phenomena is the amount of respect that he had worldwide. People admired him. I'm not just talking about the Nobel Peace Prize. When you do public opinion surveys of people and they look at America under Barack Obama, they really liked him and what he stood for. But it's not clear to me that the stature of the United States itself and its ability to interact in terms of a country with other nations is really reflected in the attitudes towards individual leaders. So yeah, he's done some things. He said some things that have pissed people off. He said a lot of things that have upset a lot of leaders. But the things that he could really do damage, pull us out of NATO, for instance. You know, the Paris thing, we can debate on how significant that is. It's not clear to me that he's really done structural damage. And a lot of the reasons why he hasn't done worse, I think, is one, the strongest part of his White House staff that I haven't talked about is his national security team. So a guy named H.R. McMaster is his national security advisor, very experienced. Secretary of Defense is a guy named Mad Dog Mattis, again, highly respected. And Rex Tillerson has a pretty good reputation. So they've been sort of a moderating voice on him. Second, again, we tend to overstate outside national security crises, even in the realm of foreign policy. Presidents are embedded in these webs of institutional relationships that predate the president, and it's very hard to extricate themselves. So we'll have to see. So far, again, with the exception of the Paris peace, climate change, there hasn't been, and again, he dropped some, and I don't mean to make light of this, he dropped some missiles on the Syrian airfield, but actually got bipartisan support for doing that. He hasn't done a lot substantively so far, 3.5 months in the presidency, to undercut the role of the United States nationally, even though on a personal level, it's pretty clear most foreign policy leaders don't like him individually.
I agree with you that structurally he hasn't done all that much damage yet. I think that reputationally he's done enormous damage. Worldwide press comments against Trump and the diminished reputation of the United States, I think, is an important non-structural feature of what he has done. But my question is actually going back to Neustadt and your work, and to ask you to reflect on the incredible changes that have occurred over the time since Neustadt wrote that book in the relationship between the White House and the agencies. It used to be, I mean, that presidents depended heavily on their cabinet.
Yes.
And the advice that they got on policy questions largely was from the cabinet,
yep.
from the secretaries.
Yep.
The White House has largely displaced them, and with the negative consequences that you outlined in one of those last slides. And I just wonder if you talk a little bit about that, because as a former government official, I found dealing with the White House much more frustrating than trying to deal with Congress. And the internal battles between the long-term and short-term perspective you talked about, I think are very debilitating to the policy process. I wondered if you would comment.
Great question, great question. This is really the central question of my research, and you've noticed in my discussion of advice to the president, the sort of the dog that didn't bark here is the cabinet. I didn't talk about the key cabinet advisors. You all know the cabinet is in sort of a semi-official, traditional source of advice to the president. It consists of the major departments, the heads, the secretaries, and historically they provided a source of advice and expertise to the president. And that was particularly the case when the cabinet was very small. So your major cabinet agencies were the State Department, Treasury. You would have an Attorney General that later headed a Justice Department. You used to have a War Department and a Navy Department. They later evolved into the Defense Department when the Air Force came. And so when the president wanted advice, he would sit with those individuals in the Roosevelt room and have cabinet meetings. The last president to have regular cabinet meetings was Dwight Eisenhower of the full cabinet. John F. Kennedy famously remarked, when dealing with Cold War policies, I don't know why I want the Postmaster General sitting at this table. And he stopped meeting. And pretty much subsequent presidents have said they're going to revitalize the cabinet, but they have not as a decision-making body. And to the extent that the cabinet plays any role, it's in those issue councils that I talked about, where you have sub-cabinets, those cabinet agencies dealing with domestic policy or economic policy. But even here, they're largely marching to orders dictated by the White House staff. What happened? Well, partly the cabinet itself had got too big. We now have 15 official cabinet agencies, and they have wildly disparate jurisdictions. And then there are a bunch of additional agencies, like the head of the EPA, that have cabinet rank, at least the officials do. So presidents don't see any virtue in them. Second, this gets to that loyalty issue. In order to head the cabinet, you need to get through confirmation from the Senate. Most of these positions require confirmation. And that means you often can't appoint somebody to head an agency that you really would like to, because the Senate is not going to approve them, particularly if it's controlled by the opposing point. So all this means is the White House has just sort of become the go-to place. And even presidents who take office saying, I am going to rely on the cabinet, ultimately find the cabinet incredibly frustrating, right? So Franklin Roosevelt famously proclaimed about the Navy Department, it's like punching a pillow. You punch here and you punch it there, and when you're done, it's the same shape. It's had no impact whatsoever. Presidents find dealing with you people in the cabinet agencies tremendously frustrating. Often you're beholden to careerists, right? This is the problem with the State Department, right? From the president's perspective, the State Department isn't a repository of diplomatic knowledge. They're a bunch of striped pants cookie pushers, right? And they usually sell out to the country they're representing. And so if I'm going to make foreign policy, am I going to talk to the State Department and Rex Tillerson and the foreign diplomats? No. I'm going to rely on my own national security advisor. It's right there next to me in the White House, H.R. McMaster, who has handpicked advisors who are loyal to me, and I'm going to trust their judgment. And from your perspective, the frustration is mutual, right? You have the expertise right here. You know that diplomacy is cultivated not in days or weeks, but months and years. And these are people who are experts in it. And the president doesn't get it. He just doesn't get why we're so important. The president wants to get things done yesterday. Diplomats say it's going to take time, right? We didn't get into the Mideast problem overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight. So you have these incentives working at cross purposes. And over time, those incentives, for better or for worse, have led presidents to undervalue the input and advice of you and to overvalue the advice of their own political loyalists. And that's what my second book is trying to get presidents to step back from that and incorporate more of the advice from people like you into it. Yeah. Get me a publisher.
We all know that TV news folk are like hyperbole.
Yes.
But given that, I was frankly surprised this morning when I heard a bunch of them sitting around saying things like, maybe the president is ill. He's coming unhinged. One of them even said, I hate to say this, but I think he's crazy. I mean, what's the remedy for
a crazy
even diagnosing?
Right. So we do have a 25th Amendment that sort of, if the president is declared mentally incapable, there's a process that goes into play. I mean, I want to point out a couple of things here. And again, this gets to the very first question. The media coverage, so one thing we do as political scientists is we code media coverage. And by code, we characterize a story as either positive or negative towards the president. And we've been doing this pretty regularly for the last 6 or 7 presidents. And so Harvard University just came out with their latest coding. They did 100 days of Trump, and they compared to the first 100 days of the previous 5 presidents, and they coded coverage in CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, CBS television. And guess what percentage of Trump's coverage was negative? 100 is, you're on to me. 93%. 93%. Now, Barack Obama of the same period was about 53% positive, 47% negative. Most presidents, it's roughly 60-40 negative positive of the recent presidents. So he's getting unusually negative coverage, historically dismal coverage. Now, that may be A, because he's earned it, nothing's gone right, or B, because for reasons that we might explore, the media has decided they are going to be the loyal opposition to this guy, this tweeter-in-chief who ridicules them at all times. And so I don't know, it may be a combination of those, but we have a toxic atmosphere when it comes to the coverage of this president. Justified or not, I'll let you decide that. But it does make me very concerned, and the other element of this coverage, a lot of it is based on unnamed sources. I spent 2 years working as a reporter, and we were taught never go off the record with an unnamed source if you can get someone to go on. Because somebody who will not put their name to their comments usually has an axe to grind. So I'm having trouble working this out as I see this coverage. I don't know how much of it reflects the reality that this guy's just incompetent. Maybe he's crazy. How much of it is a function of media incentives where they have just decided that they are the loyal opposition? How much of it reflects a structural bias to the extent that you think these news outlets represent a particular worldview, liberal, establishment? Keep in mind, and I'm not trying to draw too many conclusions, where Hillary Clinton did strongest is where these media outlets, these major media outlets are, right? Sort of the Amtrak corridor and the left coast. Donald Trump's support is not drawn from there, and that's partly why he utilizes social media so much, is he's trying to deal directly with them. So we have a problem here in trying to, I would not recommend relying solely on cable news in the morning to figure out what's happening with Donald Trump. The other thing we have to keep in mind, the media are, they have a dwindling audience, although Donald Trump has been manna from heaven here. The audience has actually gone up. But they've been losing money hand over fist, and so ratings mean everything to them. So we may be in a perfect storm of a guy. Somebody was on, it was John Roberts, who was on Fox News just before I left, and he said, Donald Trump, Sean Spicer in the meeting today said, the media hate the fact that the president uses Twitter because it means he's going over their heads. And he looked at the camera, he said, are you kidding? We get a story every time he tweets. We love Twitter. We hope he continues to use Twitter. So there's a lot of things going on here that make me, I don't think that the press is lying or out to get him, but I'm skeptical that we're getting as good a story, as good a coverage of Trump on the current media that we have under previous presidents, for a lot of reasons, some of them not having to do anything with the media as much as it is Donald Trump. Is he mentally unstable? He's impetuous. He's egotistical. He's also been in business for X amount of years. I mean, the two things I look at when I evaluate a president is how experienced is he in government and how quickly does he learn from his mistakes. This guy has no experience in government. I'm not sure how quickly he's learning from his mistakes. It may be too early to know.
Thanks, Professor. You talked, and Newsec talks in his book about FDR, and you mentioned FDR dealing with the White House staff as sort of pitting one against the other, and there being competition in getting information from the president. However, there was also a description of, in the Trump White House, there being competing factions within the White House. I'm sure there's a difference there in the way they're using competition among the White House staff, because it's produced arguably drastically different results for Roosevelt than it is doing for Trump. And I wonder if you might have any insight as to what the difference is.
Well, I think one of the differences is the modern media atmosphere is different than, so when Franklin Roosevelt dealt with the media, he'd call them into the White House. It was only print media. I mean, there was some radio. And he dealt with them under particular ground rules, which is, you come in the Oval Office, I will tell you exactly what I'm doing. You can't quote me directly unless I give you permission to do that. And there was, that was basically the primary medium to the people, those print coverage. Occasionally he'd go on radio with his fireside chats, but people overestimate how often he did that. He did it 14 times in basically 14 years in presidency. So he didn't use radio a lot. So one explanation of why it doesn't work is because these differences are magnified nowadays in a way they weren't under Franklin Roosevelt. Anytime Jared Kushner looks crosswise at Steve Bannon, it's dissension in the White House. The media loves process stories. They love to pit personality against personality, right? They don't do a very good job of covering policy substance. It's all process and personality. So I think that's part of the problem. It's just harder for a Roosevelt system to work today. But I also think Trump is no Roosevelt in the sense that I don't think he has learned how to balance, to take advantage of these competing power centers. And it's partly the fact that these competing power centers are all power centers who are politically powerful, but substantively not nearly as competent as Roosevelt's advisors. They just don't have governing experience. So if you have three incompetent groups vying for power, you're not going to generate the same type of choice options that you would if you had three very competent groups, which Roosevelt had. So I think that's part of the explanation as well. That's a great question.
And with that, thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you. I'm glad to answer your questions for those who have them.